There's nothing harder than watching your neighbors turn away when you need them most. Sometimes a man has to lose everything before he can truly find himself. Jed Colton lost his family ranch 20 years ago when the bank came calling, and the whole town of Dusty Hollow watched it happen without lifting a finger. Now he's back, riding down Main Street in old boots and a worn hat with just a black horse beside him. Folks are laughing and pointing from their porches, calling him the broke cowboy who never learned his lesson. They have no idea about the rare horses grazing on his hidden mesa, or the cattle buyer coming on today's train with more money than this town has ever seen. When that briefcase opens and the truth comes out, those same neighbors will remember why you should never count a good man down. What secret has Jed been hiding all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust kicked up by Thunder's hooves settled like old ghosts along Main Street as Jed Colton rode deeper into the heart of Dusty Hollow. His father's silver pocket watch, the one artifact he'd managed to save from the foreclosure, pressed against his chest through his worn shirt, its familiar weight a reminder of better times. Every building, every storefront, every crack in the weathered boardwalk told a story he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The Merchant's Bank still stood on the corner where it always had, its red brick facade now faded to the color of dried blood. Jed's jaw tightened as he passed, remembering the day Harold Merchant himself had walked onto the Colton ranch with papers that might as well have been death certificates. The old man's words still echoed, "Business is business, Jed. Nothing personal." But losing your daddy's land, the land 3 generations of Coltons had worked and died for, that felt pretty damn personal. Thunder snorted and shook his magnificent black head, sensing his rider's tension. The Andalusian stallion was worth more than most folks in this town would see in a lifetime, but to anyone watching, he looked like just another horse. That was the beauty of it. Sometimes the most valuable things came wrapped in humble packages. Well, I'll be damned. The voice cut through the afternoon heat like a rusty blade. Look what the cat dragged in. Jed didn't need to turn to know who was speaking. Tommy Briggs had been running his mouth since they were kids, and apparently 2 decades hadn't taught him any wisdom. The man sat on the steps of Muller's General Store, his belly straining against a shirt that had seen better days, a beer bottle dangling from his fingers at 2 in the afternoon. "Tommy." Jed nodded once, keeping Thunder moving at a steady walk. No need to stop for pleasantries with a man who'd laughed the loudest when the bank came calling. "Heard you been living up in the hills like some kind of hermit," Tommy called out, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that small-town bullies perfected over the years. "Must be hard times if you're back here looking for handouts." A few other men gathered around Tommy, faces Jed recognized but names he'd rather forget. Jake Mueller, whose daddy owned the general store. Pete Hawkins from the feedlot. Men who'd once bought drinks for young Jed Colton when his family's ranch was the pride of the valley. "Don't look like much has changed with you, Tommy," Jed said, his voice calm as still water. "Still sitting on other folks' porches, talking about things you don't understand." Tommy's face reddened, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Jed Colton, as I live and breathe." This voice was different, warmer, tinged with genuine surprise rather than malice. Jed turned to see Doc Martinez stepping out of his clinic, medical bag in hand. The doctor had aged well, his hair silver now, but his eyes still sharp and kind. "Doc." Jed touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Martinez had been one of the few people who'd treated the Colton family with dignity right up until the end, "Heard you might be coming back for the reunion," Doc said, walking closer. His eyes took in Thunder with the practiced gaze of a man who knew good horseflesh when he saw it. "That's a fine animal you've got there." "He'll do." Jed patted Thunder's neck, feeling the stallion's powerful muscles beneath his palm. "How's Maria? The children?" "All grown up and moved to the city, can you believe it? Maria's grandmother now. 3 little ones keeping her busy." Doc's smile faded slightly as he studied Jed's face. "You look well, son. Mountain air agrees with you. It's quiet up there. Man can think." "Sometimes thinking's overrated," Doc said gently. "Sometimes living's more important." From the store steps, Tommy Briggs let out a snort of laughter. "Living? On what?" "Last I heard, you didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, Colton. What you been eating up there? Pine cones and rabbit?" Jed's hand instinctively moved to his father's pocket watch, feeling the smooth silver through the fabric. Inside that watch was a photograph, the only picture he had left of his father, and the prize Andalusian mare that had started it all. She'd been beautiful, elegant, and worth a fortune to the right buyer. Too bad his daddy had been too proud to sell her when times got tough. "A man eats what he needs to eat," Jed replied evenly. "Must not be much," Jake Muller chimed in, emboldened by Tommy's jeering. "That shirt's got more holes than Swiss cheese, and those boots look like they walked through hell and back." They weren't wrong. Jed's clothes had seen better decades, and his boots bore the scars of countless miles through rough country. But appearances could be deceiving, a lesson this town was about to learn the hard way. "Clothes don't make the man," Doc Martinez said sharply, shooting a disapproving look at the gathering crowd. "Last I checked, character was measured by what a person does, not what they wear." "Character?" Tommy stood up unsteadily, the beer clearly not his first of the day. "What character is there in running away when things get tough? Real men stay and fight." The words hit their mark, and Jed felt the familiar burn of old anger rising in his chest. But he'd learned patience in the mountains. Patience and planning. Thunder shifted beneath him, sensing the change in his rider's mood. "Fighting's easy when you've got something worth fighting for," Jed said quietly. "And people willing to stand beside you." An uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Even Tommy seemed to realize he'd pushed too far, too fast. The distant whistle of the afternoon train broke the tension, its lonesome sound echoing off the mountains that ringed the valley. Jed's pulse quickened, right on schedule. "Well," he said, gathering Thunder's reins, "reckon I'll be moving along. Town's looking about the same as when I left." "Where you staying?" Doc asked. "Sarah Jenkins has been running a boarding house since her husband passed. Clean beds, good food." "Appreciate the offer, Doc, but I've got arrangements made." That was true enough. He'd be camping under the stars tonight, just like he had for most of the past 20 years. The mountains had taught him that a man didn't need much, just enough food, a dry place to sleep, and the wisdom to know the difference between what he wanted and what he needed. As he rode away from the confrontation, Jed could hear the men's voices rising behind him in speculation and judgment. Let them talk. By tomorrow morning, they'd have plenty more to discuss. The Founders' Day celebration was already beginning to take shape around the town square. Colorful bunting hung between lampposts, and volunteers were setting up booths for the festival. Children ran between the decorations, their laughter bright against the backdrop of adult conversation. It reminded Jed of celebrations from his youth, when his family had been part of this community's heartbeat. His mother had loved Founders' Day. She'd spent weeks preparing her famous apple pies, and his father would enter his best horses in the showing competition. Those had been good times, times when the Colton name meant something in Dusty Hollow. Thunder's ears pricked forward as they passed the old livery stable, where Jed had learned to shoe horses and mend tack. The building stood empty now, its doors hanging askew like broken arms. Progress, folks called it. The automobile had made horses less essential, and businesses like the livery had withered and died. But horses, real horses, bred for nobility and grace, they still commanded respect from those who understood their value. And tomorrow, the whole town would understand. The train whistle sounded again. Closer now. Jed guided Thunder toward the depot, staying in the shadows of the buildings. He wanted to see the cattle buyer arrive, wanted to study the man who represented his vindication. 20 years of planning, 20 years of careful breeding and patient waiting, all leading to this moment. The depot platform was nearly empty. Just old Pete Hawkins waiting with a mail cart and a few travelers heading out of town. The train rounded the bend with a great belch of steam and smoke, its iron wheels squealing against the tracks as it began to slow. As the passenger car doors opened, Jed spotted him immediately. The man in the expensive grey suit stood out like a peacock among sparrows. Everything from his polished shoes to his confident bearing screamed money and importance. He carried a leather briefcase and looked around the platform with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating new territory. This had to be Charles Whitmore, the Chicago cattle buyer who'd responded to Jed's carefully worded telegram. A man who dealt in livestock worth more than most people's houses, who understood that true value wasn't always obvious to the casual observer. Jed smiled grimly as he watched Whitmore scan the small crowd, clearly looking for his contact. Tomorrow morning, at the Founders' Day celebration, Mr. Whitmore would see the horses that had been quietly grazing in the high meadows above Dusty Hollow. And when the whole town witnessed that transaction, when they saw just how much those worthless animals were worth, every snicker and sideways glance from today would taste like ash in their mouths. His father's pocket watch seemed to pulse against his chest, keeping time with his heartbeat. Inside that watch was more than just a photograph. It was a promise that the Colton name would mean something again, that 20 years of exile and struggle would finally bear fruit. Thunder stamped impatiently, ready to move on. Jed gave the stallion his head, letting the magnificent animal pick their path through the lengthening shadows toward the mountains that had become his home. Tomorrow would bring vindication, but tonight belonged to preparation and memory. As they rode out of town, Jed could feel eyes on his back, curious, dismissive, pitying eyes that saw only a broken man returning to the scene of his failure. Let them look. Let them judge. Tomorrow, those same eyes would see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Sometimes the most valuable treasures were the ones nobody thought to look for. The morning sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber as Jed broke camp in the high meadow above Dusty Hollow. His father's brass compass, worn smooth by 3 generations of Colton hands, pointed true north toward the hidden valley where his real treasure grazed. The antique instrument had guided his grandfather through cattle drives and his father through the darkest nights, and now it would guide Jed through the most important day of his life. 37 magnificent Andalusian horses lifted their heads as he approached, their coats gleaming like polished silver in the early light. Each animal represented years of careful breeding, selective trading, and patient investment. They were descendants of Spanish royalty, their bloodlines traceable to the great horses that had carried conquistadors across oceans and continents. Thunder nickered a greeting as Jed approached, and the stallion's call was answered by the soft whinnies of mares and the playful snorts of young colts. This herd was worth more money than the entire town of Dusty Hollow had seen in decades, yet they grazed here in complete obscurity, hidden from the world that had rejected their owner. "Today's the day, old friend," Jed murmured, running his hand along Thunder's neck. "Today we show them what real value looks like." The ride down into town felt different this morning. Yesterday, Jed had been nothing more than a curiosity, a failed rancher returning to the scene of his humiliation. Today, he carried the weight of vindication in his saddlebags and the promise of justice in his heart. Founders' Day had transformed Dusty Hollow into something almost festive. Colorful banners stretched between buildings. Vendors hawked everything from fresh bread to hand-carved trinkets, and the sound of fiddle music drifted from the main stage. Children ran through the crowds with sticky fingers and bright smiles, their parents trailing behind with the patient expressions of folks enjoying a rare celebration. But beneath the surface merriment, Jed could feel the undercurrents of gossip and speculation. His appearance yesterday had set tongues wagging, and he caught fragments of whispered conversations as he rode through the crowd. "Heard he's been living like a wild man. Crazy to come back after all this time. Probably hoping for handouts. Let them whisper." In a few hours, those whispers would turn to stunned silence. The festival's livestock competition was set up in the old fairgrounds at the edge of town. Local ranchers had brought their finest animals, cattle, horses, even a few prized pigs, hoping to claim ribbons and bragging rights. Jed dismounted near the competition ring and began to unsaddle Thunder, taking his time and letting the curious crowds gather. "Well, well," a familiar voice called out. "Look who decided to enter the competition." Harold Merchant Jr. approached with the swagger of a man who'd never known real hardship. The banker's son had grown soft around the middle, his expensive clothes unable to hide the weakness that came from a life of inherited privilege. Behind him trailed the usual collection of hangers-on, men who laughed at his jokes because of his father's money and nodded at his opinions because of his father's power. "Harold," Jed nodded politely, continuing to tend to Thunder with deliberate care. "That's a decent-looking horse you've got there," Harold said, his tone dripping with condescension. Course, decent's about all most folks can afford these days. Not like the old times when people could afford the really fine animals. The dig was obvious and intentional. Harold was referring to the Colton family's legendary horse breeding operation, the one that had died along with their land and reputation 20 years ago. "Beauty's in the eye of the beholder," Jed replied calmly, running the curry comb along Thunder's flanks. The stallion's coat gleamed like black silk, muscles rippling beneath the surface with barely contained power. "True enough," Harold laughed. "Though I hear tell there's a fancy cattle buyer in town, fellow from Chicago who knows real quality when he sees it. Might be interesting to see what he thinks of the local livestock." Jed's hand stilled for just a moment on Thunder's neck. So Harold knew about Whitmore. That wasn't surprising. In a town this small, news traveled faster than wildfire. What was interesting was how quickly Harold had moved to position himself as the obvious choice for any serious business. "Mr. Whitmore's staying at my daddy's hotel," Harold continued, clearly enjoying what he thought was his advantage. "We had dinner last night, talked about the kind of operation he's looking to invest in. Seems he's got very particular standards." "I imagine he does," Jed said quietly. "Yeah, well, standards are important in business. Can't just throw money at any old thing and hope for the best. Takes breeding to recognize real quality. Breeding and connections." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Harold was making it clear that whatever Whitmore was buying, it wouldn't be coming from a failed rancher with nothing but pride and a single horse. "Harold," a new voice cut through the tension. Doc Martinez approached with his wife, Maria, both dressed in their Founder's Day finest. "I see you're making friends as usual." "Doc, Mrs. Martinez," Harold nodded stiffly. "Just welcoming an old neighbor back to town." "That's real Christian of you," Maria said sweetly, though her dark eyes held no warmth. "Jed, that horse of yours is absolutely beautiful. I don't think I've ever seen an animal carry himself with such nobility." "Thank you kindly, Ma'am. Thunder's got good bloodlines." "I'm sure he does." Maria's smile was genuine now. "You know, my grandmother used to tell stories about horses like this. Spanish horses with hearts like lions and spirits that couldn't be broken." Harold snorted. "Horses are horses, Mrs. Martinez. Pretty stories don't add zeros to a bank account." "Maybe not," Doc said quietly, his physician's eyes studying Thunder with growing interest. "But there's something to be said for breeding that runs true. Look at how he holds his head, how he moves. That's not just good training. That's genetics going back generations." Jed felt a flush of pride at the doctor's recognition. Doc Martinez knew horses. His family had been raising them for decades before the automobile changed everything. If Doc could see Thunder's quality, it was only a matter of time before others did too. "Speaking of breeding," Harold said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I heard Charles Whitmore is particularly interested in horses with documented bloodlines. Papers, registration, that sort of thing. Of course, that's the kind of record-keeping that takes money and connections to maintain." Another dig, another reminder of Jed's fallen status. But Harold's words revealed something important. Whitmore was indeed interested in horses, not just cattle, and bloodlines mattered to him. Good thing Jed had spent 20 years not just breeding horses, but carefully documenting every lineage, every connection to the great Spanish bloodlines that made Andalusians so valuable. "Records are important," Jed agreed. "Man should always know where he comes from." "Exactly," Harold smiled triumphantly. "Which is why I'm confident Mr. Whitmore will be most interested in the horses I'll be showing him this afternoon. Documented bloodlines going back 50 years, proper registration papers, the kind of quality that serious buyers expect." The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the tension and the magnificent stallion at the center of it all. Jed could see faces he recognized. Some hostile, some curious, a few genuinely interested in Thunder's obvious quality. "Competition starts at 2:00, Harold announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Should be interesting to see what passes for quality these days." As Harold walked away with his entourage, Doc Martinez stepped closer to Jed. "That man's got more pride than sense," he said quietly. "Always has. Ever since we were kids." "Pride's not always a bad thing," Jed replied, watching Harold's retreating figure. "Depends on what you're proud of." "True enough." Doc paused, studying Thunder again. "Jed, I don't want to pry, but that horse, there's something special about him. Something that goes beyond good breeding. Every horse is special to somebody, Doc." "Maybe so. But this one," Doc shook his head. "I've been around horses my whole life, and I've never seen one carry himself like that. It's like he knows he's royalty." Jed's hand moved unconsciously to his father's compass in his vest pocket. Doc was right, of course. Thunder wasn't just any horse. He was the culmination of 20 years of careful breeding, the living embodiment of a dream that had sustained Jed through 2 decades of exile and struggle. At 2:00, when the competition began and Whitmore got his first look at what real Andalusian breeding could produce, Harold Merchant Jr. was going to learn that some dreams were worth waiting for, and the whole town of Dusty Hollow would finally understand that they'd been wrong about Jed Colton all along. The livestock competition drew a crowd that spilled beyond the old fairground fences, with townspeople perching on hay bales and leaning against fence posts to get a better view. At the center of it all sat Charles Whitmore, the Chicago cattle buyer, his expensive gray suit and gold-rimmed spectacles marking him as clearly as a neon sign in the dusty, rural setting. He held a worn leather notebook, the kind serious men used for serious business, and made careful notes as each animal was presented. Jed positioned himself at the edge of the crowd, Thunder's reins loose in his hands. The stallion stood perfectly still, but Jed could feel the controlled energy thrumming through the magnificent animal's body. Thunder knew he was being watched, evaluated, and the horse's natural pride was evident in every line of his posture. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out Mayor Davidson, his voice carrying over the crowd with the authority of a man who'd been running this show for 15 years. "Welcome to our annual Founders' Day livestock exhibition. We're honored to have with us today Mr. Charles Whitmore, a distinguished cattle buyer from Chicago, who'll be evaluating our finest animals." Polite applause rippled through the crowd as Whitmore stood and nodded graciously. He was younger than Jed had expected, maybe 45, with sharp eyes and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to making decisions worth thousands of dollars. "The competition begins with our cattle entries," Mayor Davidson continued, gesturing toward an impressive collection of Herefords and Angus. "First up, we have the Merchant Ranch's prize bull, Caesar." Harold Merchant Jr. strutted into the ring, leading a massive Hereford bull that was undeniably impressive. The animal was perfectly proportioned, with the kind of muscled bulk that spoke of excellent breeding and careful feeding. Harold wore his best clothes and a smile that could have lit up the county courthouse. "Caesar here represents 4 generations of selective breeding," Harold announced, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of a born salesman. "His sire was purchased from the finest ranch in Kansas, and his bloodline can be traced back to champion stock in England." Whitmore leaned forward in his chair, making notes in his leather notebook. The crowd murmured appreciatively as Harold led Caesar through his paces, demonstrating the bull's temperament and conformation with the skill of someone who'd been showing animals since childhood. "Magnificent animal," Whitmore said when Harold finished his presentation. "The muscle definition is excellent, and his temperament appears very manageable. What kind of offspring has he sired?" 32 calves in the past 3 years, Harold replied proudly. "Everyone healthy, strong, and fast-growing. We've got ranchers from 3 counties wanting to breed their stock to Caesar." More approving murmurs from the crowd. Several local ranchers nodded in agreement. Harold wasn't lying about Caesar's reputation. The bull was genuinely impressive, and Harold's presentation was polished and professional. The competition continued with other cattle entries, some good, some mediocre, but none matching Caesar's obvious quality. Jed watched it all with the patience of a man who'd learned to wait for the right moment. His time would come. "Now we move to our horse entries," Mayor Davidson announced as the cattle were led away. "First up, the Hawkins Ranch presents their quarter-horse stallion, Dakota." Pete Hawkins led a solid bay horse into the ring. Dakota was a good animal, strong, well-trained, the kind of horse that would serve a working ranch faithfully for years. But there was nothing exceptional about him, nothing that would make a sophisticated buyer take notice. 3 more horses followed, all decent animals, all clearly outclassed by what was coming. Jed could see the pattern developing. The local ranchers were presenting solid, practical stock, the kind of animals that made sense in a working agricultural community. But Whitmore was looking for something more. "Next," Mayor Davidson called out, consulting his list, "we have Harold Merchant Jr. presenting his thoroughbred mare, Duchess." Harold reappeared leading a beautiful chestnut mare with clean lines and an aristocratic bearing. Duchess was everything a thoroughbred should be, elegant, refined, with the kind of bloodline that commanded respect in racing circles. "Duchess is a daughter of Northern Dancer," Harold announced, his chest swelling with pride. "Her bloodline includes 3 Kentucky Derby winners, and she's produced 2 stakes-winning colts in her 4 years of breeding." This was impressive, and Whitmore's interest was obvious. He stood from his chair and walked closer, examining Duchess with the practiced eye of someone who understood quality horse flesh. "Beautiful animal," Whitmore said, running his hand along Duchess's neck. "Northern Dancer bloodline is always valuable. What are you asking for her?" "She's not for sale," Harold replied smoothly. "But I'd be happy to discuss breeding arrangements, or possibly selling one of her offspring." Whitmore nodded, making more notes. "I'd definitely be interested in continuing that conversation." The crowd was buzzing now. Harold's presentation had been masterful, combining genuine quality with the kind of pedigree that serious buyers understood. Several townspeople shot glances at Jed, their expressions ranging from pity to amusement. How could a broke cowboy with 1 horse possibly compete with this? "Our final entry," Mayor Davidson announced, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty, "is Jed Colton presenting his stallion, Thunder." A hush fell over the crowd as Jed led Thunder into the ring. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the afternoon sun, and his movement was pure poetry, each step controlled, powerful, graceful. But Jed could feel the skepticism radiating from the crowd like heat from a forge. "Thunder is an Andalusian stallion," Jed said, simply, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. His presentation lacked Harold's polish, but there was something in his tone, a quiet confidence that made people listen. Whitmore's head snapped up from his notebook, his interest suddenly sharp and focused. "Andalusian? Pure breed?" "Yes, sir. Pure Spanish bloodline, traceable to the royal stables of Cordoba." The crowd stirred uneasily. Most of them had never heard of Andalusians, but Whitmore clearly had. The Chicago buyer was out of his chair again, moving toward Thunder with an intensity that hadn't been there for any of the other animals. "May I?" Whitmore gestured toward Thunder. "Of course." Whitmore approached the stallion slowly, respectfully. Thunder stood perfectly still, allowing the examination with the dignity of true nobility. Whitmore's hands moved expertly over the horse's conformation, shoulders, back, legs, neck, his expression growing more amazed with each passing moment. "Extraordinary," Whitmore breathed. "The bone structure, the muscle development, this is world-class breeding." Harold Merchant Jr. was frowning now, clearly confused by the buyer's reaction. "It's just a horse," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Looks good enough, I suppose. But where are the papers? The registration? Without proper documentation?" "The papers are in order," Jed interrupted quietly, reaching into his saddlebag and withdrawing a thick manila envelope. "Full registration, bloodline documentation going back 12 generations, health certificates, and breeding records." Whitmore took the envelope with the reverence of a man handling ancient treasure. As he opened it and began examining the documents, his expression shifted from interest to amazement to something approaching awe. The crowd watched in growing confusion as the sophisticated buyer from Chicago became completely absorbed in a set of papers belonging to the town's most notorious failure. Something was happening here that nobody understood. Something that was about to change everything. The silence in the fairground stretched like a taut wire as Charles Whitmore studied the documents in Jed's manila envelope. His fingers traced over each page with the reverence of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. The breeding charts, registration papers, and bloodline documentation told a story that few people in this small town could possibly understand. But Whitmore understood it perfectly. Jed's father's leather-bound breeding journal lay at the bottom of the envelope, its worn covers hiding 20 years of meticulous record-keeping. Every entry was written in Jed's careful handwriting, documenting births, lineages, health records, and the slow, patient process of building something extraordinary from the ashes of loss. "This is impossible," Whitmore whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmur of the confused crowd. He looked up at Jed with something approaching disbelief. "According to these records, you're telling me you have 37 head of pure Andalusian stock, direct descendants of Cartujano bloodlines?" "That's correct," Jed replied calmly, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Harold Merchant Jr. pushed forward, his face reddening with indignation. "Now wait just a minute. There's no way. I mean, where would he get that kind of stock? And the expense?" He gestured helplessly at Jed's worn clothes and modest appearance. "Look at him." "Appearances can be deceiving, Mr. Merchant," Whitmore said, without taking his eyes off the documentation. "What I'm looking at here represents one of the most valuable private horse collections in North America. If these bloodlines are authentic—" "They're authentic," Jed interrupted quietly. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew his father's leather-bound breeding journal, opening it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Started with one mare 23 years ago. Salvadora, daughter of Esperanza, granddaughter of the legendary stallion Conquistador." Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he took the journal. "Conquistador? The Conquistador that was stolen from the Royal Spanish Riding School in 1952. "Not stolen," Jed corrected. "Rescued. During the war, when the stables were bombed, a Spanish groom named Miguel Santos saved 12 horses, including Conquistador. He brought them to America and spent the rest of his life trying to preserve the bloodlines." The crowd was growing restless, sensing something significant happening, but unable to follow the technical discussion. Doc Martinez pushed closer, his medical training making him appreciate the precision and detail in Jed's records. "Miguel Santos died when I was 19, Jed continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man telling a story he'd carried for decades. He'd been trying to sell his horses for years, but couldn't find buyers who understood their value. Most folks just saw expensive animals that ate too much and couldn't pull a plow or work cattle. "So you bought them?" Whitmore asked, completely absorbed in the narrative. "Bought one. Salvadora. Cost every dollar my father had saved, plus a loan against the ranch." Jed's jaw tightened with old pain. My daddy thought I was crazy. Spending that kind of money on one horse when we needed practical stock for working the ranch? Harold snorted. "Sounds like your daddy had more sense than you did. No wonder you lost the place." The cruel comment hung in the air like smoke. But Jed didn't flinch. He'd heard worse over the years, and besides, Harold didn't understand what had really happened. "The drought hit 2 years later," Jed continued, speaking directly to Whitmore now. "Lasted 3 seasons. Cattle prices dropped, feed got scarce, and the bank started calling notes. My daddy wanted me to sell Salvadora to save the ranch." "But you didn't," Whitmore said softly. It wasn't a question. Couldn't. Salvadora was pregnant with her first foal, Thunder's grandfather. Miguel Santos had made me promise to preserve the bloodline, to keep it pure. Said these horses were living history, and once they were gone, they'd never come back. Maria Martinez stepped closer, her grandmother's stories about Spanish horses suddenly making perfect sense. "So you chose the horses over the ranch?" "I chose the future over the present," Jed replied. "The ranch was already lost. We just didn't want to admit it. But the horses—" He gestured toward Thunder, who stood listening to the conversation with the intelligence that marked his breeding. The horses were forever. Whitmore was frantically calculating in his notebook now, cross-referencing bloodlines and making notes about genetic diversity and breeding potential. Mr. Colton, if what you're telling me is accurate, if you've been breeding Cartusiano Andalusians for 20 years with proper genetic management, the whole herd's grazing in the high meadow about 5 miles north of here, Jed said simply. You're welcome to see them anytime. The crowd erupted in confused chatter. Tommy Briggs pushed forward, beer still in hand despite the afternoon hour. This is ridiculous. Charlie, you're talking about some broken-down cowboy like he's got a gold mine up there. Look at his clothes. Look at his horse. It's just another horse. Mr. Briggs, Whitmore said coldly, finally looking up from his calculations. What you're calling just another horse is worth more than every animal in this competition combined. And if Mr. Colton has 36 more animals of similar quality, he paused, consulting his notes again. We're talking about a collection worth somewhere between $8 and $12 million. The number hit the crowd like a physical blow. Several people actually stumbled backward, and Tommy Briggs dropped his beer bottle, which shattered on the dusty ground with a sound like breaking dreams. Million? Harold's voice cracked like a teenager's. That's impossible. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious, Whitmore replied. Andalusians of this quality, with documented Cartujano bloodlines, are among the most sought-after horses in the world. There are Saudi princes who would pay $250,000 for a single animal, and European collectors who've been searching for these exact bloodlines for decades. Doc Martinez let out a low whistle. Jed, do you understand what this means? You're not just wealthy. You're one of the richest men in the state. Jed's hand moved unconsciously to his father's breeding journal, feeling the weight of 20 years of careful entries, detailed observations, and unwavering faith in a vision that everyone else had called foolish. Means I can finally keep my promise to Miguel Santos, he said quietly. Means these horses will survive and flourish like they were meant to. Harold Merchant Jr. was staring at Thunder with a look of dawning horror. Finally, understanding that everything he thought he knew about status and value in this town had just been turned upside down. The broke cowboy who'd been run out of Dusty Hollow 20 years ago had just become the wealthiest man in the county, and the competition wasn't even over yet. The transformation in the crowd's behavior was swift and unmistakable, like watching a flock of birds suddenly change direction mid-flight. Where moments before there had been snickers and whispered ridicule, now there was stunned silence, punctuated by urgent, hushed conversations. Jed could see the mental calculations happening behind their eyes. The same neighbors who'd written him off as a failure were now trying to reconcile his worn clothes and modest appearance with the staggering wealth Whitmore had just revealed. Mayor Davidson cleared his throat nervously, clearly struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. His ceremonial gavel, a gift from the town's founding families that had presided over decades of competitions, trembled slightly in his hand as he tried to restore order to the proceedings. Well, the mayor said, his voice unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet, that certainly was educational. Mr. Whitmore, would you like to examine any other animals before we— Actually, Whitmore interrupted, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. I think I've seen everything I need to see. Mr. Colton, would it be possible to visit your herd this afternoon? I'd very much like to see the rest of your stock. Of course, Jed replied calmly, though inside he felt a surge of vindication so strong it made his knees weak. They're about an hour's ride north. We could head up there now if you'd like. Harold Merchant Jr. stepped forward desperately, his earlier confidence cracking like ice in spring. Now hold on just a minute. Mr. Whitmore, surely you want to discuss my animals as well? Caesar alone represents— Mr. Merchant, Whitmore said politely but firmly. Your bull is indeed impressive, and your thoroughbred mare is beautiful. But I'm afraid my clients are specifically looking for something much more unique. The Andalusian bloodlines Mr. Colton has preserved are exactly what I've been searching for. The dismissal was courteous but final. Harold's face went through several shades of red before settling on a mottled purple that clashed badly with his expensive shirt. Around him, his usual circle of supporters began to edge away, the social mathematics of the town shifting in real time. Tommy Briggs, still staring at the broken beer bottle at his feet, looked up with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of the world had just been shattered. "Jed," he said uncertainly. "I mean, Mr. Colton. Sir, I was just kidding around earlier. You know how it is, old friends giving each other a hard time." The attempt at damage control was pathetic, and everyone knew it. Jed studied Tommy's face for a long moment, remembering every sneer, every cruel joke, every time this man had kicked him when he was down. "I remember exactly how it was, Tommy," Jed said quietly. "And I remember exactly who my friends were when times got hard." Doc Martinez stepped forward, his weathered face creased with something that might have been pride. "Jed, I have to ask, why didn't you ever say anything? All these years letting folks think— Think what?" Jed interrupted. "That I was a failure? That I'd made bad choices and lost everything?" He shrugged. "Maybe I had lost everything that mattered to most folks, but I still had what mattered to me." Maria Martinez nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her dark eyes. "Your grandmother's stories," she said to her husband. "Remember? About the Spanish horses that were like kings among animals? She always said they'd come back someday." "These horses never left," Jed said simply. "They've been here all along, waiting for people to remember their value." Whitmore was growing impatient, clearly eager to see the rest of the herd. "Mr. Colton, if we could— Actually," Harold interrupted desperately, "I think there might be some legal issues here. I mean, without proper veterinary certification, import documentation, the horses were born on American soil," Jed said calmly, "and Dr. Martinez has been their veterinarian for the past 5 years. Haven't you, Doc?" Doc Martinez nodded slowly. "Every animal in Jed's herd has current health certificates and vaccinations. I drive up to his place twice a year for wellness checks. Finest horses I've ever worked with." "You've seen them?" Harold's voice cracked with disbelief. "Of course I've seen them. Who do you think delivered half the foals?" Doc's tone was growing sharp. Jed never made a secret of what he was doing. He just never felt the need to brag about it to folks who wouldn't understand anyway. The revelation that Doc Martinez had known about the horses all along sent another shock through the crowd. If the respected doctor had been involved, if he could vouch for the animal's health and authenticity, then Whitmore's incredible valuation was undoubtedly real. Mrs. Peterson from the general store pushed forward timidly. "Jed, Mr. Colton, I just wanted to say, about that time you needed credit for feed, and we couldn't— Water under the bridge, Mrs. Peterson," Jed said gently. The older woman had always been kind to him, even when times were hardest. Her refusal to extend credit hadn't been personal. It had been survival in a small business with tight margins. "But if there's anything we can do now," she continued hopefully, "any way the store can help with your operation." Jed almost smiled at the transparent attempt to get on his good side now that his circumstances had changed, but he kept his expression neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging her overture. Whitmore consulted his pocket watch, a beautiful gold timepiece that probably cost more than most of her the townspeople made in a year. "Mr. Colton, I really would like to see your herd while there's still good light. Perhaps we could continue these conversations later?" "Of course." Jed gathered Thunder's reins, preparing to mount. "Anyone who wants to see the horses is welcome to come along, though I should warn you, it's rough country. Not everyone's built for mountain riding." The challenge was subtle, but unmistakable. 20 years ago, these same people had shown their true colors when he needed support. Now they'd have to decide whether their newfound interest was worth the effort required to back it up. Harold made one last, desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Whitmore, I hope you'll reconsider my offer. The merchant ranch has been a cornerstone of this community for generations. We have the infrastructure, the connections, the reputation." "Mr. Merchant," Whitmore said patiently, "I'm sure your ranch is very impressive, but infrastructure and reputation don't create bloodlines that took centuries to develop. What Mr. Colton has preserved is irreplaceable." As Jed swung up into Thunder's saddle, he caught sight of his reflection in the window of the mayor's truck. The same weathered face, the same worn clothes, the same modest appearance that had drawn scorn and ridicule just hours earlier. But now, somehow, everything had changed. Not because he was different, but because everyone else finally understood what he'd always known. Sometimes the most valuable things in the world came wrapped in humble packages, and sometimes a man's worth couldn't be measured by the clothes he wore or the money in his pocket. Sometimes it could only be measured by the promises he kept and the dreams he refused to let die. The procession that followed Jed up the mountain trail bore little resemblance to the crowd that had gathered for the livestock competition. What had started as nearly 50 curious onlookers quickly dwindled to a determined dozen as the reality of the 5-mile mountain ride set in. Jed's father's old surveying chain, hanging from Thunder's saddle as both practical tool and reminder of the land measurements that had once defined the Colton family's boundaries, clinked softly with each step as they climbed higher into the thin air. Charles Whitmore rode a borrowed horse with the careful concentration of a man more accustomed to train compartments than mountain trails. Doc Martinez sat his mount with the easy confidence of someone who'd been riding these paths for decades, while Maria had opted to wait in town, understanding that this journey was about more than sightseeing. Harold Merchant Jr. had insisted on coming, despite his obvious discomfort on horseback. His expensive riding clothes, clearly purchased for show rather than function, were already showing dust and strain. Behind him rode Mayor Davidson, sweating profusely and clearly regretting his decision to join what he'd assumed would be a casual afternoon ride. Tommy Briggs had lasted exactly 1 mile before turning back, muttering excuses about having to help his wife with something urgent. 3 others had followed him, leaving only the most determined, or most calculating, members of the original group. "How much further?" Harold called out, his voice tight with exertion and barely concealed irritation. "About another mile," Jed replied without turning around. "Trail gets steeper from here, though." The path they followed was barely wide enough for single-file riding, carved into the mountainside by decades of careful use. Jed had maintained it himself over the years, clearing fallen trees and reinforcing weak spots with his own hands. Every stone, every turn, every vista point held memories of the solitary life he'd built in exile. As they climbed higher, the landscape opened up to reveal vistas that took the breath away. Rolling hills covered in golden grass, distant peaks topped with snow even in summer, and the kind of pristine wilderness that reminded a person how small they really were in the grand scheme of things. "Beautiful country," Whitmore observed, his earlier impatience giving way to genuine appreciation. "How long have you been living up here?" 20 years, give or take." Jed replied. "Built my cabin about 2 miles from where we're heading. Close enough to watch the horses, far enough away to give them space." 20 years of solitude, Doc Martinez mused. "That takes a special kind of man." "Or a stubborn one," Jed said with a slight smile. "Depends on your perspective." Harold's horse stumbled slightly on the rocky path, and he grabbed the saddle horn with white knuckles. "This is insane," he muttered. "No wonder nobody knew about these horses. Who's going to come all the way up here to buy livestock?" "People who understand value," Whitmore said simply. "Mr. Colton, I have to say, keeping your herd this isolated was actually brilliant. Most horse operations deal with constant stress from visitors, potential thieves, disease exposure from other animals. Your horses have been living in what amounts to a protected sanctuary." Jed nodded thoughtfully. The isolation hadn't been planned as a business strategy. It had been born of necessity and pain. But Whitmore was right. The horses had thrived in their mountain paradise, free from the pressures and problems that plagued most breeding operations. They crested a ridge, and suddenly the hidden valley spread below them like something from a fairy tale. Green meadows stretched between stands of aspen and pine. A crystal-clear stream wound through the center, and scattered across the grassland like living jewels were the horses. Even from a distance, their quality was obvious. They moved with a grace and nobility that set them apart from ordinary animals, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun, their bearing proud and alert. 37 magnificent creatures, each one a masterpiece of breeding and genetics. "Sweet Jesus," Mayor Davidson breathed, pulling up short at the vista. "Jed, I had no idea." Whitmore was already dismounting, his notebook forgotten as he stared at the scene below. "This is extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary." Harold remained mounted, his face pale beneath his expensive hat. The reality of what he was seeing, the sheer scale and obvious quality of Jed's operation, was finally sinking in. This wasn't some lucky accident or exaggerated story. This was a world-class horse breeding program that had been operating in complete secrecy, just miles from his own ranch. "How do you manage them all?" Whitmore asked as they began the descent into the valley. "Feed, water, medical care for this many animals?" "Stream provides water year-round," Jed explained. "Meadows have enough grass for the herd, supplemented with hay. I grow in the lower pastures. As for medical care," he nodded toward Doc Martinez. "Doc makes house calls twice a year, more if needed." As they rode closer, individual horses began to lift their heads, watching the approaching riders with intelligent curiosity rather than fear. A magnificent grey stallion, Thunder's father, Jed realized, cantered over to investigate, his movement so fluid it seemed choreographed. "That's Alejandro," Jed said, as the stallion approached. "Thunder's sire, Salvadora's first colt." Whitmore slid from his horse and approached Alejandro with the reverent care of a man handling priceless art. The stallion allowed the examination, standing perfectly still as the buyer evaluated his conformation, his temperament, his obvious quality. "The bone structure is perfect," Whitmore murmured, running his hands over Alejandro's legs. "Look at that neck, that natural arch, and his disposition, completely calm, completely confident." More horses were gathering now, drawn by curiosity and the presence of Thunder, who was clearly the herd's acknowledged leader despite his youth. Mares with foals at their sides, young stallions testing their developing strength, older animals bearing the wisdom and dignity of their bloodlines. "Mr. Colton," Whitmore said finally, straightening up and fixing Jed with an intense stare. "I need you to understand something. What you've accomplished here, it's not just impressive, it's historic. These bloodlines, this genetic diversity, the quality of your breeding program. There are kings who would envy what you've built." Harold dismounted unsteadily, clearly overwhelmed by what he was witnessing. "I don't understand," he said weakly. "How is this possible? The expense, the knowledge required." 20 years of reading," Jed said simply. 20 years of learning from every mistake, every small success. 20 years of putting the horse's needs above everything else. Doc Martinez was examining a mare with a young foal, his professional eye taking in details that the others missed. "Jed, the bone density on these animals. The muscle, development. What are you feeding them?" "Mountain grass, clean water, and respect," Jed replied. "Turns out that's all they really needed." As the sun began to sink lower in the western sky, casting long shadows across the hidden valley, Whitmore pulled out his notebook and began making calculations that would change everything. The broke cowboy's secret was finally revealed, and it was more magnificent than anyone had dared imagine. The golden light of late afternoon painted the hidden valley in shades of amber and honey as Charles Whitmore finished his examination of the herd. His notebook was filled with measurements, observations, and calculations that grew more extraordinary with each entry. But it was the small leather pouch he withdrew from his briefcase, containing what appeared to be an antique medallion that would transform this already remarkable day into something approaching the miraculous. "Mr. Colton," Whitmore said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone stop what they were doing. "Before we discuss business, there's something you need to know about why I'm really here." Jed paused in his grooming of thunder, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. "I thought you were looking to buy horses for your clients in Chicago." "That's true, but it's not the whole truth." Whitmore held up the medallion, its silver surface catching the dying light. "This belongs to the Royal Spanish Riding School in Vienna. It's been in my family for 3 generations, ever since my great-grandfather served as their head trainer before the war." Harold Merchant, Jr., who had been sitting dejectedly on a fallen log, looked up sharply. "What does that have to do with anything?" Whitmore ignored Harold's question, his attention focused entirely on Jed. "My great-grandfather, Heinrich Whitmore, was there the night Miguel Santos rescued the horses from the bombing. He helped load them onto the ship that brought them to America, and before Santos left, he gave my great-grandfather this medallion and made him a promise." The elderly buyer's hands trembled slightly as he opened the medallion to reveal a small photograph, faded and worn, but clearly showing a magnificent stallion in formal riding pose. He promised that if the bloodlines ever surfaced again, if someone had successfully preserved what he'd saved, the royal school would want to know. Doc Martinez stepped closer, his physician's eye noting the obvious authenticity of the old photograph. "That's Conquistador, isn't it?" "Yes," Whitmore breathed. "And if Mr. Colton's documentation is accurate, every horse in this valley carries Conquistador's blood." He looked directly at Jed, his eyes bright with something approaching awe. "Do you understand what this means?" Jed's hand moved unconsciously to his father's pocket watch, feeling the familiar weight against his chest. Inside that watch was his own photograph of Salvadora, taken the day he'd bought her from Miguel Santos. He'd carried it for 23 years, never imagining it might connect to something larger than his own small dream. "I'm not sure I follow," Jed said carefully. "The Austrian government has been searching for these bloodlines for 70 years, Whitmore explained, his excitement growing with each word. When the Royal School was rebuilt after the war, they lost more than just buildings. They lost genetics that took centuries to develop. The Lipizzaner breeding program was decimated. Mayor Davidson, who had been quietly struggling with the altitude and the day's revelations, found his voice. "You're saying these horses are connected to those white horses we see in the movies? The ones that dance?" "The Lipizzaner breed shares common ancestry with the Andalusians," Whitmore confirmed. "But more importantly, the specific bloodlines that Mr. Colton has preserved, the Cartujano lines, they're the missing link the Royal School needs to restore their breeding program to its full potential." Harold stood up abruptly, his face flushed with renewed indignation. "This is getting ridiculous. You're talking about some kind of international conspiracy over a bunch of horses in the middle of nowhere. Next you'll be telling us Jed sitting on the crown jewels." Whitmore's smile was enigmatic. "In a sense, Mr. Merchant, that's exactly what I'm telling you." He withdrew a thick envelope from his briefcase, not the manila folder containing business documents, but something far more official-looking, bearing seals and ribbons. "This is a letter of authorization from the Austrian Ministry of Culture and the director of the Royal Spanish Riding School. They've empowered me to negotiate for the acquisition of proven Cartujano bloodlines, with a budget that—" He paused, consulting the documents. "Well, let's just say money is not a consideration." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the horses seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, several of them lifting their heads to watch the humans with intelligent curiosity. "How much money are we talking about?" Doc Martinez asked quietly. Whitmore consulted his papers again. "The Royal School is prepared to offer $25 million for exclusive breeding rights to Mr. Colton's entire herd, plus an additional $5 million per year for the next 20 years to manage and expand the breeding program under their supervision." The numbers hit the small group like physical blows. Harold actually staggered backward, his face going pale. Mayor Davidson sat down heavily on the nearest rock, his ceremonial bearing completely forgotten. $50 million, Harold whispered. "You're talking about $50 million. Over 20 years, yes," Whitmore confirmed, though the initial payment would be $25 million immediately upon signing the agreement. Jed stood perfectly still, Thunder's reins loose in his hands, trying to process what he'd just heard. $25 million. Enough to buy half the state of Montana. Enough to transform not just his life, but the entire region. "There's more," Whitmore continued, clearly enjoying the effect his revelations were having. "The Austrian government is prepared to designate this valley as an official breeding preserve, with full diplomatic protection and international recognition. Mr. Colton would become the official custodian of one of the world's most important genetic treasures." "Diplomatic protection?" Doc Martinez asked. "What does that mean?" "It means this herd would have the same legal status as a national monument," Whitmore explained. "Complete protection from seizure, taxation disputes, or government interference. The horses would be considered cultural treasures of international significance." Harold was staring at Jed with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if he were seeing him for the first time. "I don't understand any of this," he said weakly. "How did you know? How could you possibly have known that these horses were—" "He didn't know," Whitmore interrupted. "That's what makes this so remarkable. Mr. Colton preserved these bloodlines simply because he believed they were worth preserving. He had no idea of their international significance." Jed finally found his voice. "Miguel Santos never mentioned any of this. He just said the horses were special, that they needed protecting." "Santos was a simple man who'd been through terrible trauma," Whitmore said gently. "He probably didn't fully understand the significance of what he'd saved. He just knew it was important to keep the bloodlines pure and hope that someday the right person would recognize their value." The medallion in Whitmore's hand caught the light again, its silver surface reflecting the faces of the horses that grazed peacefully around them. Jed could see the chain of connections now. Santos rescuing the horses from war, his own father's faith in buying Salvadora, 20 years of patient breeding, and now this moment when the circle finally closed. "Mr. Colton," Whitmore said formally, "on behalf of the Austrian government and the Royal Spanish Riding School, I'm authorized to make you an offer that would change your life forever. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, you've already accomplished something extraordinary. You've preserved a piece of living history that the world thought was lost forever." As the sun sank lower behind the western peaks, painting the hidden valley in shades of gold and crimson, Jed Colton, the broke cowboy who'd been run out of Dusty Hollow 20 years ago, realized that he was now facing a decision that would affect not just his own future, but the preservation of genetic treasures that dated back centuries. The horses that had been his companions in exile, his solace in loneliness, and his faith in dark times were about to become his gateway to a destiny he'd never imagined possible. And the whole world was about to learn that. Sometimes the most valuable things in life came not from seeking wealth or recognition, but from keeping promises to those who could no longer speak for themselves. In his pocket, his father's watch ticked steadily onward, marking time toward a decision that would echo through history. The campfire crackled softly in the gathering darkness as the small group settled in for what would prove to be one of the most consequential nights in Dusty Hollow's history. Jed's grandfather's cast-iron coffee pot, blackened by countless fires and carrying the wisdom of 3 generations of mountain men, sat warming over the coals, its familiar weight and shape a comfort in a world suddenly turned upside down. Charles Whitmore had insisted on spending the night in the valley rather than attempting the treacherous ride back to town in darkness. Mayor Davidson, despite his obvious discomfort with outdoor accommodations, had agreed to stay as well, recognizing that he was witnessing something that would fundamentally change their small community. Harold Merchant Jr., however, had opted to make the dangerous night ride back to town, his departure marked by muttered complaints and the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the mountain silence. Doc Martinez sat cross-legged by the fire, his weathered hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, his medical mind still processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. "Jed," he said quietly, "I keep thinking about what your father would say if he could see this." Jed poured coffee into his own cup, the ritual as automatic as breathing after 20 years of solitary campfires. "He'd probably say I was still too stubborn for my own good," he replied with a slight smile, spending 20 years proving a point that could have been made in 20 minutes. "Could it, though?" Whitmore asked from his makeshift bedroll. Despite his expensive suit and city ways, he'd adapted to the mountain setting with surprising grace. "Mr. Colton, what you've accomplished here required more than just good breeding stock. It required vision, patience, and an almost supernatural faith in something most people couldn't see." The businessman pulled out his notebook again, though in the firelight it was impossible to read his calculations. "I've been thinking about your decision all afternoon. $25 million is life-changing money, but I want you to understand something else. If you accept this offer, you'll be giving up more than just ownership of your horses." "How so?" Mayor Davidson asked, leaning forward with the intensity of a man whose town's future might hang in the balance. "The Austrian breeding program is extraordinarily scientific," Whitmore explained. "Every aspect of the horses' lives would be monitored, controlled, optimized. They'd live in climate-controlled barns, eat precisely measured feed, exercise on schedules developed by equine physiologists. It would be the most advanced horse breeding program in the world." Jed's hand moved unconsciously to the coffee pot's handle, feeling the smooth wood worn by decades of use. And if I don't accept? Then you continue what you've been doing, Whitmore said simply, but with the knowledge that these bloodlines are even more precious than you realized, and with the certainty that other offers will come, from governments, from private collectors, from people who see dollar signs rather than living history. The implication hung in the night air like smoke. Once word got out about the true value of Jed's herd, his 20 years of peaceful isolation would be over forever. The hidden valley would become the center of international attention, whether he wanted it or not. There's something else you need to consider, Doc Martinez said slowly. The impact on Dusty Hollow itself. That kind of money coming into our community. It would change everything. Change how? Whitmore asked, his businessman's curiosity aroused. Well, for starters, the mayor said, finally finding his political voice again. We'd need to upgrade our infrastructure. The road up to this valley, for instance. It couldn't handle the kind of traffic an international breeding operation would generate. Jed looked up sharply. What do you mean? Think about it, Mayor Davidson continued, his mind already racing through possibilities. Veterinarians flying in from Vienna, genetic specialists from universities, tourists wanting to see the famous horses. We'd need a proper road, maybe even a small airstrip, hotels, restaurants, gift shops. You're talking about turning this into some kind of theme park, Jed said, his voice carrying a warning edge. Not a theme park, Whitmore said carefully, but certainly a destination. The Royal Spanish Riding School attracts hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. There's no reason a properly managed breeding facility couldn't do the same. Doc Martinez was shaking his head slowly. Jed spent 20 years protecting these horses from exactly that kind of attention. Now we're talking about putting them on display for the whole world. The conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of hoofbeats approaching through the darkness. Thunder raised his head from his grazing, nickering a greeting to the approaching horse. A few moments later, a familiar voice called out from the shadows. "Hello, the fire!" "Maria?" Doc Martinez called back in surprise. "What are you doing up here?" Maria Martinez rode into the firelight on her sturdy mare, her face serious in the flickering glow. "I came to tell you what's happening in town," she said, without preamble. "Word's gotten out about the horses and the money. The whole place has gone crazy." Jed felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean, crazy?" "Harold got back about an hour ago and started telling everyone who'd listen about $50 million and international conspiracies," Maria explained as she dismounted. "Half the town thinks he's lost his mind, but the other half is already making plans." "What kind of plans?" Mayor Davidson asked nervously. "Tommy Briggs is trying to file some kind of claim on the mountain, saying his grandfather's ranch included mineral rights up here. The Petersons are talking about expanding their store to handle international tourists. 3 different people have asked me if I know how to cook Austrian food." Whitmore was taking notes again, his pen moving rapidly in the firelight. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," he murmured. "Once news of this magnitude gets out, it takes on a life of its own." "There's more," Maria continued grimly. "A reporter from the county newspaper is driving up from the state capitol first thing in the morning." Harold called him with the story. The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. By tomorrow afternoon, news of the discovery would be spreading beyond Dusty Hollow. By the end of the week, it could be national news. His sanctuary, his 20 years of careful privacy, would be shattered forever. "Mr. Colton," Whitmore said gently, "I don't want to pressure you, but Maria's news changes the timeline considerably. Once this story goes public, you'll be dealing with more than just an offer from the Austrian government. There will be competing bids, legal challenges, media attention. People trying to take advantage, Doc Martinez added grimly. Lawyers, agents, all sorts of folks who smell money. Jed stood up abruptly, walking to the edge of the firelight where he could see the horses grazing peacefully in the moonlit meadow. They had no idea that their quiet world was about to be turned upside down, that their value had been measured in numbers that would make them the center of international attention. What do you think Miguel Santos would want? He asked quietly, not turning around. The question surprised everyone, including Whitmore, who had to think for a moment before answering. I think he'd want the bloodlines to survive and flourish. That was always his primary concern, even if it meant giving up the peace and freedom they've had here. I don't know, Whitmore admitted. That's a question only you can answer. Jed's grandfather's coffee pot began to whistle softly on the coals, the sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. 3 generations of his family had made decisions around fires like this one, weighing options that would affect not just their own futures, but the legacy they'd leave behind. His father had chosen to risk everything on Jed's vision of preserving the horses. Miguel Santos had chosen to trust a young man with the genetic treasures he'd rescued from war. Now it was Jed's turn to choose between security and sanctuary, between wealth and wilderness, between sharing his miracle with the world and protecting it from the world. The horses continued their peaceful grazing, unaware that their future hung in the balance as a small group of humans sat around a campfire, wrestling with a decision that would echo through history. In his pocket, his father's watch ticked steadily toward dawn, and the moment when everything would change, one way or another. Tomorrow, Jed Colton would have to decide not just what kind of future he wanted for himself, but what kind of legacy he wanted to leave for the magnificent creatures that had been his only companions through 20 years of exile. The broke cowboy who had preserved a miracle was about to discover that some decisions were too big for any one person to make alone. But he was the only one who could make this one. Dawn broke over the hidden valley with the kind of crystalline clarity that only came at high altitude, painting the meadows in shades of gold and emerald as the morning mist lifted from the stream. Jed's mother's pewter mirror, the one artifact he'd saved from his childhood home, reflected his weathered face as he splashed cold mountain water on his skin, preparing for what would be the most important day of his life. The campfire had burned down to glowing coals during the night, but the coffee pot still sat warm on the stones, testament to generations of Colton practicality. Around the dying fire, his unexpected guests were stirring. Charles Whitmore folding his expensive suit jacket with the careful precision of a man unaccustomed to sleeping rough. Mayor Davidson groaning softly as he worked the kinks out of his back. Doc and Maria Martinez quietly discussing the implications of what they'd witnessed. Thunder approached through the morning stillness, his breath visible in the cool air, and nuzzled Jed's shoulder with the familiar affection of 20 years together. The stallion's dark eyes seemed to hold an understanding of the momentous decision that lay ahead, though perhaps that was just projection from a man facing the hardest choice of his life. Sleep at all? Doc Martinez asked, approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Some. Jed accepted the coffee gratefully, though the truth was he'd spent most of the night walking among the horses, touching their necks, remembering the years of solitude and patience that had brought him to this moment. Any thoughts about what you want to do? Before Jed could answer, the distant sound of engines drifted up from the valley below, vehicles struggling up the mountain road that had seen little traffic beyond Doc's twice-yearly visits and the occasional supply run. Sounds like our peaceful morning is about to end, Maria said grimly, shading her eyes as she peered down toward the trail. Whitmore consulted his gold pocket watch with the practiced motion of a man whose life was governed by schedules and deadlines. That'll be the reporter Harold called, I'd guess, and probably others. The first vehicle to appear was a dusty pickup truck bearing the logo of the county newspaper, followed by a sleek SUV that clearly didn't belong to anyone from Dusty Hollow. Behind them came what looked like half the town, cars and trucks strung out along the mountain road like ants following a trail of sugar. "Well," Jed said quietly, "reckon privacy's officially over." The procession of vehicles struggled up the final steep section of trail, engines whining in the thin air, city cars scraping their undercarriages on rocks that mountain vehicles would clear easily. When they finally reached the meadow's edge, doors began opening to disgorge a collection of people that looked like something from a fever dream. A young woman with a camera and notebook emerged from the newspaper truck, followed by a man in an expensive suit who had the bearing of a lawyer or government official. The SUV produced two more people with professional cameras and recording equipment, clearly media from somewhere far beyond the county limits. Behind them came the townspeople, Harold Merchant Jr. leading the charge with the triumphant expression of a man who'd delivered the story of the century, Tommy Briggs lurking behind him with the guilt-ridden look of someone hoping to be forgiven for past sins, Mrs. Peterson clutching a basket of what appeared to be homemade pastries, as if food could bridge the gap between her former dismissal and current desperation for forgiveness. "Mr. Colton," the newspaper reporter called out, already approaching with her pen poised. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Mountain County Tribune. I understand you've been hiding a multi-million-dollar horse operation up here for 20 years. "Hiding might be the wrong word," Jed replied calmly, though his hand moved unconsciously to his mother's mirror in his vest pocket. "Never made a secret of what I was doing. Just didn't see the need to make a fuss about it." The man from the SUV stepped forward with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in the room. "Mr. Colton, I'm Robert Hayes from the State Agricultural Commission. We need to discuss the regulatory implications of an operation of this magnitude." "What regulatory implications?" Doc Martinez asked sharply, his protective instincts kicking in. "Well, for starters," Hayes replied, consulting a tablet computer, "import permits, breeding licenses, health certifications for international transport. An operation worth $50 million can't simply exist in regulatory limbo." Whitmore stepped forward smoothly, his businessman's instincts recognizing a potential threat. "Mr. Hayes, I assume you have proper authorization to investigate Mr. Colton's operation. These horses are private property on private land." "Actually," Harold Merchant Jr. interrupted loudly, his voice carrying across the meadow, "that's not entirely clear. The mineral rights to this section of mountain were never properly transferred when the original homestead—" "Harold," Jed's voice cut through the growing babble with quiet authority. "This is still private land, and these people are still my guests. I'd appreciate it if you'd remember that." The rebuke was gentle but unmistakable, and Harold's face reddened as he realized he'd overplayed his hand. Around them, the horses continued their peaceful grazing, seemingly oblivious to the human drama unfolding in their sanctuary. Jennifer Walsh was scribbling frantically in her notebook. "Mr. Colton, how does it feel to discover you're one of the wealthiest men in the state?" Jed looked around at the crowded meadow, at the reporters and officials and townspeople who'd come seeking some piece of his sudden fortune, at the magnificent horses who'd been his only companions through 20 years of exile, at the mountains that had sheltered his dreams when the rest of the world had given up on him. "Feels like it's time to make a decision," he said simply. The silence that followed Jed's words stretched across the meadow like morning fog, broken only by the gentle sound of horses cropping grass and the distant murmur of the mountain stream. In his weathered hands, He held his father's original land deed, yellowed with age, and bearing the signatures of 3 generations of Coltons who had called this valley home, the one document that established his unquestionable right to make this decision. "Mr. Colton," Charles Whitmore said gently, understanding the gravity of the moment, "whatever you decide, I want you to know that preserving these bloodlines for 20 years is already an extraordinary achievement." Jennifer Walsh's pen hovered over her notebook, ready to record whatever came next for the front page of tomorrow's newspaper. The government official, Hayes, stood with his tablet poised to document any regulatory violations. Tommy Briggs and Mrs. Peterson watched with the desperate attention of people hoping their past cruelties might be forgiven in light of future prosperity. Harold Merchant Jr. opened his mouth to speak again, but a sharp look from Doc Martinez silenced him before he could add more complications to an already complex situation. Jed walked slowly among the horses, Thunder following at his shoulder like a faithful shadow. Each animal represented years of careful breeding, infinite patience, and unwavering faith in a vision that everyone else had called foolish. The grey mare Esperanza, Salvador's daughter and the grandmother of half the herd, lifted her head as he passed, her wise eyes seeming to understand that this moment would define the future of everything Miguel Santos had died trying to preserve. "These horses have been living free for 20 years, Jed said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain air. "They've never known bars or schedules or scientists measuring their every breath. They've just been horses, magnificent, wild, and completely themselves." He stopped beside Alejandro, Thunder's father, and ran his hand along the stallion's powerful neck. "Mr. Whitmore, your offer is generous beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. $25 million would change not just my life, but this entire community." Mayor Davidson leaned forward eagerly, already calculating infrastructure improvements and economic opportunities. "But," Jed continued, "there's something else to consider. Something that's worth more than any amount of money." He pulled the land deed from his vest pocket, unfolding the fragile document with careful reverence. "This deed was signed by my great-grandfather in 1887. It grants ownership of this land to the Colton family in perpetuity, with all mineral rights, water rights, and, this is the important part, grazing rights for livestock in the high meadows." Hayes looked up sharply from his tablet. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that under the original homestead provisions, this land has been in continuous agricultural use for over a century, which means it's protected under federal agricultural preservation laws from seizure or forced development." Whitmore nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "You're invoking agricultural sanctuary status." "That's exactly what I'm doing," Jed confirmed. "As of this moment, I'm designating this valley as the Santos Memorial Horse Preserve, named after the man who saved these bloodlines from extinction." The crowd stirred uneasily, sensing that Jed's decision wasn't going to benefit them in the ways they'd hoped. "The preserve will be managed as a working ranch," Jed continued, "with the horses living exactly as they have for the past 20 years. Free, natural, and protected from commercial exploitation." "But the money!" Harold burst out, his dreams of reflected prosperity crumbling. "You're walking away from $50 million. "No," Jed said calmly. "I'm choosing something worth more than $50 million. I'm choosing to keep the promise I made to Miguel Santos 20 years ago." Jennifer Walsh was writing furiously. "Mr. Colton, what about the international significance Mr. Whitmore mentioned? The Austrian government's interest?" Jed looked at Whitmore, who nodded with understanding and professional respect. "The Royal Spanish Riding School is welcome to send representatives to study our bloodlines," Jed said. "They can take DNA samples, document genetics, even arrange limited breeding exchanges. But the horses, stay here, living as horses should live. That's not the same as a full breeding program, Whitmore pointed out, though his tone held no criticism. No, it's not, Jed agreed, but it's something better. It's preserving not just the genetics, but the spirit that made these horses special in the first place. He folded the land deed carefully and returned it to his pocket, next to his father's watch and his mother's mirror, the artifacts that connected him to generations of Coltons who had understood that some things were too precious to sell. The Santos Memorial Horse Preserve will welcome visitors by appointment, he announced. Educational groups, researchers, people who want to learn about conservation and heritage breeding, but this will never become a tourist attraction or a commercial operation. As the word settled over the gathered crowd, the horses continued their peaceful grazing, unaware that their future had just been secured not by the promise of wealth, but by the choice to preserve the freedom that had made them magnificent. Jed Colton had just turned down $50 million to keep a promise to a dead man and honor the trust of creatures who had never asked for anything but grass, water, and the freedom to be themselves. 1 year later, Jed stood on the same ridge where he'd first revealed the hidden valley to Charles Whitmore, watching the morning sun paint the meadows in familiar shades of gold and green. In his hands, he held a new artifact, a brass plaque crafted by the Austrian government and personally delivered by the director of the Royal Spanish Riding School, officially recognizing the Santos Memorial Horse Preserve as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for genetic conservation. The valley looked much the same as it always had. 43 horses now grazed in the meadows, 6 new foals born during the past year, each one a testament to the continuing vitality of the bloodlines Miguel Santos had died protecting. Thunder stood watch over the herd, with the dignified bearing of a king surveying his kingdom, his black coat gleaming in the early light. But some things had changed. A small, tasteful visitor center, built from local stone, nestled at the valley's entrance, designed to blend seamlessly with the mountain landscape. Solar panels provided power for essential services, and a water treatment system ensured the stream remained pristine for generations of horses to come. The infrastructure was minimal, respectful, and completely reversible, exactly as Jed had insisted. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence, but these weren't the chaotic invasion of reporters and opportunists that had marked that momentous day a year ago. Today's visitors arrived in a small convoy of university vehicles, bringing the latest group of graduate students from the International Equine Genetics Program to study what had become known worldwide as the Colton Collection. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the University of Córdoba emerged from the lead vehicle, her research team following with the careful precision of scientists who understood they were working with irreplaceable genetic treasures. Over the past year, she and teams from Vienna, Kentucky, and a dozen other institutions had documented bloodlines that traced back through centuries of careful breeding, creating a genetic map that would guide horse preservation efforts worldwide. "Good morning, Jed," Dr. Rodriguez called out as her team began unloading their equipment. "Ready for another day of making history?" Jed smiled, still adjusting to being addressed by first name by some of the world's most distinguished equine researchers. "Dorthiwa, horses are ready. Question is whether your students can keep up with them." The educational programs had become one of the preserve's most successful initiatives. Young researchers from around the world came to study not just genetics and breeding techniques, but the philosophy of conservation that had guided Jed's work. They learned that true preservation meant protecting not just bloodlines, but the conditions that allowed those bloodlines to flourish naturally. Charles Whitmore appeared from the second vehicle, his expensive suits now replaced by practical field clothes that showed the wear of regular mountain visits. His role had evolved from potential buyer to passionate advocate, helping establish the international network of supporters who funded the preserve's operations and research initiatives. "Jed," he said, approaching with the easy familiarity of a friendship forged through shared purpose. "The delegation from Japan arrives this afternoon. They're particularly interested in your natural feeding program." "Thunder will be happy to demonstrate," Jed replied. He always was a show-off. The morning proceeded with the organized chaos of scientific research. Students took measurements, collected DNA samples, and documented behaviors while the horses accepted the attention with the patient dignity that marked their breeding. Alejandro, now recognized as one of the most genetically significant stallions in the world, submitted to examination with regal tolerance. Around midday, Doc Martinez arrived with his monthly veterinary visit, though his role had expanded far beyond medical care. He'd become something of a celebrity himself, the country veterinarian, whose expertise with Andalusian horses was now sought by institutions worldwide. His twice-yearly speaking tours helped fund medical programs in rural communities across 3 states. "How are they looking?" Jed asked, as Doc finished examining the newest foals. "Perfect as always," Doc replied. "These bloodlines are so stable, so healthy. It's like they were designed by nature herself." "Maybe they were," Jed said quietly. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the valley, the research teams began packing their equipment and preparing for the journey back to town. The Japanese delegation had come and gone, deeply impressed by both the horses and the preserve's commitment to natural management practices. Plans were already in motion to establish similar sanctuaries in other countries, using the Santos Memorial model as a template for genetic conservation worldwide. Jed stood again at his favorite overlook, watching the horses settle into their evening routines. Thunder approached through the gathering dusk, as he had every evening for 21 years, seeking the quiet companionship of the man who had chosen freedom over fortune. In his pocket, the artifacts that had guided his journey, his father's watch, his mother's mirror, his grandfather's compass, rested alongside newer treasures, letters from children whose class projects had been inspired by the preserve's story, photographs from researchers whose careers had been launched by studying the Colton collection, and a simple brass medallion from the Spanish government honoring his role in preserving their equine heritage. The UNESCO plaque would be installed tomorrow in a ceremony attended by dignitaries from a dozen countries, but tonight belonged to the horses and the man who had kept faith with a promise made to a dying stranger 24 years ago. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jed reflected on the journey that had brought him from exile to international recognition, from financial ruin to wealth beyond measure. Not the wealth offered by Austrian buyers, but the deeper richness that came from knowing his life had preserved something irreplaceable. Miguel Santos had been right. Some treasures were worth more than money, more than comfort, more than the opinions of neighbors who measured worth by the wrong standards. Some promises were worth keeping regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new discoveries, new opportunities to share the miracle hidden in these mountains for so long. But tonight, as Thunder stood peacefully beside him under the vast Montana sky, Jed Colton, former broke cowboy, current guardian of genetic treasures, knew that he was exactly where he belonged. The horses were safe, the bloodlines would continue, the promise was kept. And sometimes that was worth more than all the gold in the world.